Hi, everyone. I am here with Michlas, the Danish Debater, as he's known on Twitter and around here on YouTube. And he watched the last three videos that I did, interviews, one with Speed of Sound, one with Dr. Dan, and one with Standing for Truth. And he came up with just some things points that he wanted to make regarding those three talks. So I invited him on to talk about that. Welcome, Michlas.
Hey there, Rebecca. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what inspired you to do this?
Well, as you know, but I don't think everyone knows, I'm an atheist. I call myself a probabilistic atheist. That is, when I look at what I've seen, back and forth evidence, experiences, and all these different things, I make a back of the envelope calculation in my head, and to me, it just seems like atheism and naturalism seems like the most probable pathway to what we have now. But I also find all these talks and discussions between atheists and religious people extremely interesting. And especially when we come to topics like the age of the earth and evolution, because I feel like those two views are extremely opposing to each other, but people are trying to look for what they find to be the truth. As I've also said, it's very few young earth creationists that I can honestly say that I respect. That's just to be fair, because a lot of them I find to be very dishonest. I also find that in my own camp, it's not that. But you, Sal, and Peter from Paleologos was the three first young earth creationists that I actually could say, okay, I actually believe that you believe what you're saying, and you're doing your best to explain what you think and why you think as you do. So I thought, when I saw this video with Standing for Truth, with Dr. Dan, and with the Speed of Sound Mike, I thought, okay, so why not talk about why I, as a layman, believe more what Dr. Dan and Mike are saying, why these things convinces me more than what Standing for Truth or Donnie is saying. I thought, well, why not? Let's try, and then they can all three bash me later for absolutely butchering their arguments and points.
Okay, cool. So should I bring up your slides?
Yeah, we should just go like that. I will say I'm on my laptop right now, so I cannot see if people are writing in the chat or anything. So if anything comes up, please feel free to stop me.
I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, but maybe this is going to come up in your slides, but you mentioned that you felt like in some of the conversations, people weren't really answering my questions and objections. Yes, so I was kind of curious what you heard there. Is that part of your presentation?
No, it's actually not part of the presentation, because I didn't find it relevant for why I found those evidence more compelling than the others. Now I have to think back. It was in the discussion with Speed of Sound, his Why I Believe Evolution, if I remember correctly. And I also mentioned it to him later that I found that the questions you were asking were not being addressed. And what was it on? I can't remember right now.
That's okay.
All right, I think I actually commented right in your video, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think you did. Yeah. Okay, let me pull up your slides then.
Okay, cool. So are they up?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, are ERVs and mutations equal evidence for evolution and young earth creationism? Because that's basically what I find that each side have been arguing, that these are evidence for their side of the thing. So the question is, are they equal evidence for both sides? And this comes from background of these three videos, examining ERVs evidence for evolution, and ERVs evidence for evolution, and why I believe in evolution. I know that the Speed of Sound was not talking about ERV specifically. He was talking about mainly mutations, actually, and many other things, signs, if I remember correctly. But I think his his arguments fit together with the other two.
Okay.
So first, I've put up a rough of what I, as a layman, see as the claim from young Earth creationism, and yeah, well, basically that everything was created some 6,000 years ago, and everything we see today is descendants of those creations, without any variation that make them what we would call other species. So we don't have the basic. There is no, cats are not descended from a common ancestor with dogs or with fish, for instance.
Right.
There might be some thing we could classify as speciation, but that would be due to a loss of variation within a kind. So, for instance, right now we have a huge diversity in the size of dogs. And if you only had the Chihuahua and the Great Dane left because everything else was destroyed, well, then you would effectively have a at least natural speciation event because they could not interbreed naturally, at least. So I guess that would, for young Earth creationism, count as a speciation event. But still, it would still be dogs, just wouldn't be able to interbreed. And then evolution, well, says that everything has a common ancestor, and we have these various pathways such as mutation, adaptation, selection, and extinction event, as well as a geographical separation. That means that the various species have diversified over time and has reached the spectrum we have of creatures today. And plants, for the matter, not just creatures, all living organisms. But one of the first things I actually wanted to mention was a few misunderstandings I commonly see in this discussion. And one of them is the question about what is a distribution, what is sequences, and what is the value of something. And in the same path, what are single events versus parallel processing? And this is because I often hear people using statistics as arguments for and against their position, and it's of course good to some degree. I'm sorry, I have to look at the camera. I have to remember that. But a lot of things seems to be misunderstood. So first of all, we have distribution. In this case, this is if you take 10 dice, normal 6-sided dice, and you roll them one by one or at the same time, what are the chances that you gain 0 to 10 dice that actually have a 6 on them? And as we can see, the chance of getting 10 sixes is 0.000000165%. It's very low, right? And
yes,
you will often see this as an argument, either with dice or with coins or something like that, that this just doesn't happen. It would be much more likely that you have one 6-sided, 1 6. That's 32% chance that you have that in 10 dice. But that's the distribution. What people tend to forget is that 10 6-sided dice is also a sequence. And it's just one of all the possible sequences you could have. And in fact, let's take 2 dice instead. If you have 2 dice, you have 36 different sequences you can have. And each sequence has the same chance of coming up, 1 in 36.
okay.
And if you have 10 dice, each and every single sequence has the same chance of 0.000165. It doesn't really matter what sequence we are talking about. So gaining a 1, 5, 4, 6, 4, 1, something like that, is just as unlikely as just gaining 6s. It's just that gaining the 6s is what we think is extraordinary, basically.
Right.
It's something that we put into it. On the other hand, we could say there's also the value. What is the odds of gaining a combined value of 6? So, for instance, if you have a 5 and a 1, or a 4 and a 2, well, suddenly you have a 13% chance of gaining this value. And the reason I'm mentioning these 3 different things, the distribution, the sequence, and the value, is because when we are looking at oh, sorry, I had one point more before we go to that. And that's all in what's called a single event. That is, if you just do it once. right? I mean, if you rolled 10 dice and they all turned out sixes, you would be pretty impressed, I guess, or astounded. I've actually had someone argue a few weeks ago that that would be a miracle for that to happen. And I can't agree that that would be a miracle, because if we're just taking 1% of the human population right now, we would have 70 million people. And if 70 million people roll 10 dice over their lifetime, it doesn't have to be at once, just 10 dice in a row somehow. There's actually a total of a 68% chance that at least one of them will gain 10 sixes.
Right.
And that's a parallel process instead of a single event.
Right.
And a lot of people have a hard time with these high numbers when they see a very low chance of something occurring. They think, okay, then it can't happen. Well, it can. Of course, the chances are low, but the more times you repeat the process, the greater chance it will happen at least once, right? And evolution is built upon, among other things, these notions that we have multiple different sequences that can all lead to the same value. We don't know if we need to have an eye, for instance, made in one specific way. We know that there are multiple different eyes that can view things. We also know you don't even necessarily need eyes to navigate. We have creatures that navigate by sound or by electricity or other sensory inputs. So we can reach a lot of different stages in a lot of different ways. And we also know that it's a parallel processing. It's not like I have to get a specific mutation for humanity to get that mutation later. Someone within humanity just needs to have it, and it just has to prevail long enough to be spread out. So that's one of the misunderstandings that people tend to do, I think. What do you think about that? Is that something that you have seen or heard?
Well, I mean, you're explaining it in a good way, but I'm not sure that I know how you're applying it to the chances for mutations, coordinated mutations, because in the case of the dice, you at least have the possibility, right? Like and the possibilities, like you said, they're equal. Now, there would be some possibilities that would seem to be like, from our vantage point, like, more unlikely. Because they look, orderly to us. But with regard to mutations producing something, I'm not sure that there are the equal chances that you're talking about.
But you don't have to be equal at all. It's just if you have a chance and an event is happening multiple times, well, then that chance of that event outcome happening rises. For instance, let's say we have a 1 in 10 chance that something happens every single day. Well, every Monday it's 1 in 10, Tuesday it's 1 in 10, Wednesday it's 1 in 10. But what is the chance that it will happen at least once during Monday or Tuesday? Well, it's 19%. It's not 10% any longer. It's 19% that it will happen at least once during those 2 days. So even though whatever it not happening has a higher chance of 90% on day 1 and on day 2, combined for it to happen just once over those 2 days rises, and the chance for it to not happen within that time frame gets lower. Does that make sense?
Well, can you tell me how you are specifically applying this when it comes to evolution?
Yes, let's take bacteria. It's one of the easier ones to explain because we have such high amounts of bacteria. If we want one specific mutation to happen to a gene, let's say a duplication of a gene, well, we know that duplications do happen, and we don't see any restrictions to what specific genes can and cannot be duplicated, at least as far as I'm aware. There might be some that has a higher chance of being duplicated and a lower chance of being duplicated. Okay, fair enough. but you have millions of bacteria over a very short time. So that means this event of this gene specifically being duplicated gets higher over a longer time, just as the 10% becomes 19% after 2 days of happening at least once, right? When you have an event having having a chance of happening, millions of times, the chance of it happening at least once in all those millions of times is larger. Does that make sense?
Yes, but you're simply talking right now about duplication, and we need a lot more than duplication for.
Of course, we need a lot more than duplication. But let's just say that we're talking about a gene that allows, and now I'm thinking specifically of the Linsky experiment, right? I know you have heard about that one before, at least in some talks. So we have the duplication, and as far as I understand, in this case, the duplication will allow the organisms within the within the experiment to digest the things they can already digest better. Now, not something new, just the things they can already digest. So this means that this duplication has a chance to propagate throughout the entire population, and within time getting fixed within the population. Now we can say, okay, now we have a full population with this duplication. But we also know that this gene, if it mutates, allow them to digest citrate. I think it was citrate, can't pronounce it, which they couldn't before, which would be a new food source for them. So now when one of them have a chance mutation, again, a very low chance, but millions of times, suddenly we have a part of the population that can digest a food source that the other part of the population couldn't. So suddenly we have the chance of those going into niches. So we can have two parallel populations, not fighting for the same food source. And it can still survive eating the old food source if it needed to. So we suddenly have what I would classify as evolution. We have a new trait come about. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. Now, I might have misunderstood something in these experiments. I'm absolutely aware of this. I am a layman. I'm trying to rectify that by reading a lot right now, but that's new for me. I'm not within biology at all. But this makes sense to me, at least. Where was it? Yeah, that was the first one. Anything else with that? Or should we try and continue?
Nope, we can continue.
Cool. I don't know why I keep looking at my mic instead of at my camera. That's
it's fine. You know what? You're small on the screen anyway. Your slides are the main feature, so I don't think it's going to matter.
Cool. The next thing I think is brought up a lot is the idea that we have to observe an event or have witnesses of it to know that it happened. Now, I don't put that much faith in witnesses necessarily, but they could be a good source of information. But let's say that we enter a cave, and I'm sorry for the crude paint drawings. I made these yesterday. I lost a full day of preparation.
No problem.
But let's say that we walk into a cave, and within this cave we find these what's it called, stalactites, and I can't remember the structures from the ceiling and on the floor, right?
Oh yeah, the stalagmites and stalactites. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, awesome. You know, I have no idea about this stuff. I'm just looking at what I could figure out here. And we noticed that the water is dripping from the top and falling down. We also noticed that the water is depositing some minerals all the time at a somewhat stable rate, right? Now we could try to calculate back and say, okay, then this must be this and that old. But we could also try and examine these structures. And if we found within one of the structures that inside it suddenly, let's say 2 centimeters in, we have another mineral than the one on the top, we can start to wonder, why is that? And we can start to examine the environment. What can we actually observe right now? We cannot not observe it being built, right? Because it's already done, this inner structure. But when we look above, we will see that, okay, there's a ravine above this cave. And this ravine has a small river running through it. And this river have cut through various sediments, and the last 2 layers it has cut through is the same minerals as the stalactites within the cave. And then we look up and see, okay, so what are the layers above this? And then we try to think, okay, so our guess is that water has seeped down through the ceiling of the cave and has deposited these minerals over time and has generated the stalactite. If this is true, we should also see the other minerals deeper within these structures. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we don't know for sure that this is how they are built. But we can see from the things that we do observe that this is a possible process. And we can make some predictions. And if we're willing to destroy the structures in this case, we can also see if this is true, right? And this is something that's done within a lot of fields of science. We are trying to look at what can we observe, what can the outcome be from this, and what do we think would be the combined outcome of these things over a longer period of time, be that 10 years, 1,000 years, or a million years. Of course, the longer we extrapolate, the less precise we will be. That's, I think that's just unavoidable. But of course, if we then find things that confirms our evidence, such as the inner structures here, well, then we can try and apply it to other observations. That's not specifically to evolution, but I hear some arguments being taken up that sounds like this. Like, for instance, we do see mutations today. We do see ERVs being integrated into organisms. We do see what's called these mutations and ERVs being passed down over this over generations. So, and from that, I think we can extrapolate a lot of the way. And then this is one specifically for Donnie. He had this the analogy of an ERV becoming functional, being like a robber breaking into your home, and then befriending you, and then helping you to defend against robbers. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And I have to say, I think that's a very bad analogy for what's actually happening. I would more identify it like a technologically superior nation attacking you with some special forces or something like that, attacking your nation with special forces. But simply due to your numbers, you are able to defeat these attackers. And when you defeat them, you are taking their weapons and their plans, if they have any, their codes and everything. And then you start in your nation to analyze these and try to use them to defend against another attack from the enemy, because the ERV within your body is not an active virus. It's a virus that has originally integrated into your system to use it to multiply itself. But later, your body has at least attempted to turn it off. That is, defeating it, right? And if later a mutation happens that allows us to use one of the functions that are within the ERV to produce, for instance, specific proteins or other things, well, that is adapting the enemy's weapons, not having the enemy working for you, if that makes sense.
Yes, but the thing is, Michlas, we're still in question about whether or not these ERVs, the ones that are functional in our genome, the question is, are they appropriately named ERVs? Are they actually what is being proposed? Or were they an original feature of the genome? And so I kind of feel like this is like a big, like just assumption that just because some scientists slap the name ERVs on them and you know that the sequence happens to be the same, even though they actually have a function within our genome, there's this gigantic assumption that they are in fact something that made their way into our genome and that we've co-opted and made to work for us. So that's the problem that I'm having is whether or not Donnie's analogy is a good one or not. I mean, there's still a gigantic question that has not been answered about this.
I
ERV
actually
situation.
I agree with that from the talks, and we're not even in the PowerPoints yet. Sorry, there are a
Oh,
lot.
okay. Yeah, no
Um,
problem. You said you
the,
have 100 slides. I don't know how many
yeah,
we've gone through, but yeah, let's do
no,
it.
not as many as I would have expected by now. This is just the basic misunderstandings that I see that doesn't really apply, but I think it's a question of framing. Because if you frame it as the virus going into your body and then working for you, yeah, that seems like a stretch to me. But that's not what I understand the argument to be for ERVs. Rather, I see it as the invasion that I talked about, where we then use the enemy's technology to keep them at bay, or for other benefits, for the matter. So that's why I had that one. But I actually agree with you that at least in those talks, yeah, there were some arguments, but I don't think they were absolutely the best arguments that could be given in that case.
Okay.
But that's why I had the other one, that if we can see some processes, we can see mutations happen, we can see ERVs going into our bodies, we can see various different things, and I think that at least gives us a pathway, right? It doesn't say that this is what happened, but it does give us one possible pathway. We don't see right now any exo nihilo creations. That doesn't mean it never happened. We just don't see it, or at least I haven't, and I don't know of anyone who has any documents to say they have. But that's of course one debate point. I'm just debating from what we do see. And the last one is actually a bit on that. That is, God could, would, or did not do it like that. I think that's one of the worst arguments I've heard from my side, is the saying, why would God do it like that, or God couldn't do it like that? Well, that's assuming a lot from my side, I would say, because if
Yeah.
God is real, he could do it absolutely as he would, and we don't know why he would do it as he would. So there's a lot of options there open to him. We just don't know how he did it. I don't think that God did it would be an explanation for how it happened, but I can't say that it couldn't happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Good.
So I think that's out of the way. So now we're actually starting to the major observations, I would say. Under creation or young Earth creationism, any organism has a set of genes that is made individual for each kind, right? And ERVs could be original designed, which is what I think Donnie was arguing for. I've also heard some young Earth creationists arguing for that they were put into man at the fall, because, the world was going to be a very awful place to be suddenly. So God gave us these extra tools to fight off viruses or some things like that. And then there's the last option, that they are accumulated over the generations from Adam and Eve and up until now. Those are like three different views you could take under young Earth creationism. And I think most fall for the first, not fall for what's called, are inclined to the first option, that is part of the original design. Because it wouldn't make much sense in my world that God would later have to retrofy his design. But some people would accept that, I guess. Then there is the option, the observation that some of the ERVs are the same across different kinds, and this is deliberate for God because he knows that some creatures inhabit the same environments and will be met with the same challenges as other creatures. So it makes sense for him that fish has one set, and of course they live in water, they drink water, so we might have some of them when we are in contact with water. Apes are closer resembling us, so they might be hit by the same things as us, the same diseases and the same challenges. So it makes sense they have the same ERVs as us to protect. And now I know ERV would be a mislabeling under that assumption, but I'm just using ERVs just to so we talk the same. And then the last one is that the mutations that I know, at least Donnie accept happens, are accounting for those ERVs that are not functional, or for the changes we see in the ERVs that has come about later. Those that, as I understood, he did accept that we do see ERVs integrating into the system, but those are separate from the other ERVs. Do you think that is
good
roughly correct?
presentation. Yep.
Cool.
Very good presentation.
Now, I do want to give Donnie a point here, because I think he did absolutely the correct thing about not accepting them accumulating over many generations. I don't think any young Earth creationists should accept them accumulating over many generations. And there's a reason for that. The reason is the odds of it. If they were accumulated over many generations, then you actually have the probability problem of them being integrated in the same way across different lineages that allows us to make a phylogenetic tree. I mean, why would they integrate the same place in the great apes as they do in humans if there's no relation? So it doesn't make sense that they have integrated as the result of viral infections. Secondary, there are 98,000 ERVs in the human genome. If that had happened over 8,000 years, that would be 16 integrations per year. And if you say that a generation is 12 years, that's a very fast generation. Well, then you have more than 196 retrovirus infections per generation. And that's just those that actually get fixed into our germline. Those are staggering numbers. To put it mildly, that would mean you would have a viral retrovirus infection integrating into your system twice a year throughout your life.
I'm really impressed that you took the time to do these numbers.
Yeah, it's just, it doesn't make sense. If you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, and if humans have 98,000 ERVs, I mean, imagine Noah's Ark, putting this down here. We are talking about these 8 people taking care of all the animals, while over this year having more than 150 infections of various kinds, and the animals having just as many infections. I mean, that would be a dead boat. I mean, I can't see any way that makes sense to accept that under young Earth creationism. But of course, that's my take on it. But I think Donnie did the right thing here and saying, nope, that's not for me. I know some young Earth creationists would argue that ERVs are naturally occurring, because I've seen that debate. Dr. Dan was in it. And I'm sorry, just doesn't make sense. But that was not Donnie's, at least. Then we have the evolution side of it instead. Here we are saying that the various genes are arising naturally over many generations and over speciation events, and that ERVs are the result of viral infections that slowly gets fixed within the population. And that the reason that we see ERVs in the same spot is evidence for ancestry, because they came within the ancestry. And that, again, that mutations are real and account for broken ERVs, basically, but also for the adapted ERVs. And this is where I think Donnie would disagree, where he would say the adapted ERVs are not adapted, they are created, as I understood it. So here's the question: what do we actually observe within reality? Well, we observe viruses integrating into our DNA. We observe them in the germlines. We observe them mutating, and we observe genetic code that resembles, and this is for the YEC, I say resemble, ERVs and contain mutations. And we observe the distribution of these ERVs and mutations. We can debate what this distribution is, but we do observe it.
Okay, what do you mean by distribution?
So we observe that there is a lot of these things that we, for this talk, will call ERVs that are shared among all vertebrates.
Okay,
there's something that's shared among, and now how they came about we can debate, but we do observe them at least. And I hope you agree with that point, that we observe them. And now, I put up a disclaimer here because the pictures I've chosen are not representative of what neither young Earth creationism nor what evolution says. They are just rough estimates of animals that I could find that fit within, right? So they are just for illustrative purpose. But now I want to run what's called a pen, paper, and die simulation. I was considering constructing a computer simulation for this, but I decided to go with this much more simpler simulation because anyone can actually make this simulation and see that I'm not just fudging the numbers, basically. You don't need to be a programmer to do it. You just need to own a single dice and a paper to do it.
Okay.
If we have 8 creatures of the sign, we will all have some sort of ERVs within them. And of course, under young Earth creationism, these are created at the start. They are created with some that are the same for all animals, some that are the same for some groups. And as we go down, we will see smaller and smaller groups having these. Right. This is what we observe. There's no doubt in my mind, and I don't think in Donnie's mind, or I don't even think in your mind, that we observe these distributions as I've put them out here. The question is how they became like they are. And the colors and everything I've chosen is extremely simplified. It's not the size of ERVs. It's not how you represent them normally. It's just done so you can do it on paper. It is deliberately done so we have 6 by 6 in each organism here.
Okay.
And that's because if you're using a dice simulation, that's just nice numbers to use and nothing else. So why would they have this distribution under that common design? Well, it could be a defense against viruses, as has been argued. It could be that common environments give common pathogens. Common design is at risk from common threats, and a common defense could fight off a common enemy, basically. This is the main points I think I've heard being used generally within young Earth creationism. What do you think of those?
I'm amazed by you, Michlas. I feel like you're really paying attention to the arguments on both sides. And this is so rare. I mean, honestly, I feel like most of the time, people who believe in evolution do not actually think about the arguments on the other side, don't pay attention to them, and just ignore them and like press on, with their, arguments. But I right now, I feel like you have a real grasp of like the position that I'm coming from. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. That's I think that's the only way to move forward within any discussion. And I will be honest, half a year ago, or maybe it's a year ago, I wouldn't have done this. And that's mostly because I didn't have anyone within young Earth creationism that I felt that I could respect enough to even give the ideas serious thought. And that has been close-mindedness on my side. I'll be honest and say that. So thank you to you, Sal, and Peter for at least allowing me to explore this side. I'll be honest, it has put me even more, what should we say, safely within my own camp later on. But it has also allowed me to examine why I am at the position I am. It has awoken a huge interest in biology for me that I did not have beforehand. So cool. Thank you for that. So to me, this makes sense on some level. I mean, it makes sense that if God wanted creatures to share the same environment, of course, you would give them some sort of defense against the same threats, right? And opportunities for the matter. It doesn't have to be negative, it could be positive as well. But then let's see what the evolution idea is. In evolution, you have a population of some creatures. And before anyone is butchering me on the evolution side, I'm sorry that I'm using amoebes here. I just couldn't find enough vertebrates to use it from that point on. So I'm going from this point instead. And these creatures will get some sort of ERV infections at some point, and this will spread out throughout the population within the germline. And as these creatures undergo speciation due to other mutations and environmental change and such, these ERVs are inherited by their children. But their children may also acquire ERVs, and their children, and their children, and their children, and their children, right? Does this make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Well, now we have this phylogenetic tree, and we have this set of ERVs in these 8 organisms. And if we look at them side by side, you have on one side the young earth creationism, and you have on one side the evolution. I don't see there's any way to tell these two apart, at least not with this. And that's my deeply honest opinion. I do think it might be a bit of an ad hoc, but I don't think you can argue that there's any reason why God wouldn't do it like this. I think that would just be assuming too much on my side of the fence.
Cool.
So yeah, and this far, I think there's no reason to do that. If we look at these different things, we can say, okay, so how much is shared between 2 creatures? For instance, we have the lemur and the chimpanzee here, and they are sharing 30 out of 36 of their genes within their ERVs, right? And it would be the same. If we then took all the different creatures and put them up side by side, we would see the same distribution. You might be able to see that there's 2 major groupings of green. We have the fish, the duck, the lemur, and the chimpanzee in one grouping. And then you have the butterfly, the ant, the scorpion, and the centipede, I think, in the last grouping. And if you look a bit more, you can also see in the first grouping, it seems more like a gradient between the animals, where in the second grouping, it's like there are 2 subgroupings within them. We have the butterfly and the ant in one subgroup, and the scorpion and the centipede in another. Mm-hmm. And again, for any evolutionist, I'm sorry for the choice of animals. I'm sorry that they don't fit together. It is just images. Call them squares and triangles if that makes it better for you. Or replace them with some animals you know have this distribution. I did not look up an actual phylogenetic tree to get the correct positioning of these. So the numbers are purely for the DICE simulation, and the images were chosen afterwards, the best that I could. So yeah, we are identical. So let's see if we can do something if we actually add mutation to the system. And this is why I'm also mentioning Speed of Sound's video with you, because he was talking more about mutations than the other 2 were. It's not that he didn't talk about it, he was just talking more about it. So the thing we'll do is that we will go through 6 iterations, which were the same as I showed earlier with both the young earth creationism and with the evolution model. And for each iteration, we will roll dice for all the living organisms to give them mutations. And under evolution, we won't have 6 ERVs in the first generation because, as I showed earlier, it only had 1 ERV. In the second generation, it had 2, and the third, it had 3. So we will mark this with the gray spots just to show where the mutation would have happened if there were actually a gene at that point, an ERV, sorry. And again, a quick disclaimer here. This is just to illustrate a non-deterministic system. So I haven't picked the numbers. I haven't chosen that this should be the result. But mutations are not seen as fully random. I think this is a horse that has been beaten a lot of times. But people have a tendency to either say that evolution has to be fully random or that it has to be fully deterministic. And it's not. As I know has been mentioned in those 2 videos, we have hot spots, we have cold spots, we have the chance of genes being repaired, we have selection pressure, purifying events, and all these things that I think young earth creationism also agree that we have. They just don't agree that it can lead to evolution. So we basically have a non-random distribution of all these things. But for illustrative purposes, sorry, I can't say that word right now, we will just use random. So first we will look at the young earth creationist model. And we will use the word organism to mean a population of interbreeding kinds. So if I say organism, I might be talking about 1,000 chimpanzees, right? It's not a single organism, it's a population. And when I say iteration, I'm not talking about one parent-daughter relationship. I'm talking about many, many generations, as many as young earth creationism would allow for in this case. Because again, we do know that young Earth creation accept that mutations happens and they are passed down, at least within kinds. Because if not, then genetic profiling or anything wouldn't work. So, and we know it does. And to show how it works, we will take the organism and we will roll the 2 dice. And these will indicate, the first one, the white one, will indicate which ERV we are targeting of the 6 ERVs. And the second one will indicate what spot we are targeting. Then we'll mark the spot. I hope it shows up on the screens, but the spot turned pink instead of red. And we will repeat this once. So we have done it twice for each organism, right? This is what's called a dice simulation. Right now we can make random events happening within the population. And this way we can add mutations to all of them. And this was for one iteration, one generation. We will do this for a total of 6 generations, and we will also mark, if the same spot mutates again, we will mark it yellow instead of pink. And if it happens one more, we will mark it lime, just to make sure we can see how many times something has mutated. As we do this more and more times, we will at the end up with some distribution of ERVs with mutations, right? And this will be our final generation in this case. As before, we can compare 2 organisms, and we can say, okay, what do they have in common? In this case, they have 20 out of 36, giving them a 55.6 similarity. That's a bit lower than before, where it was 30 out of 36, but they are still similar, right? But we can also choose to just compare the mutations that they have. And you have 3 out of 16, or in this case, 18% possible of the possible mutation spots. And I know this could still be created by God. There could be a purpose with these mutations being distributed as they are. But we'll still look at it. If we take the same graph as before, we can now see we still have groupings within the design with mutation, and it's still readable. We could still generate a phylogenetic tree that would be somewhat precise. There are a few things that have changed a bit, but they're still usable. But if we, on the other hand, look just at the mutations, that's the design only mutation chart, we can't build any functional phylogenetic tree, at least not one that resembles the one we see in reality in any way, and not one that resembles the original designed ERVs. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, we have some groupings, but not within the mutation. But before we draw any conclusions, just because we have this with the mutations, we should, of course, subject evolution to the same process, right? Something has to be different because we start a bit different with the generations under evolution than we do in young Earth creationism. But we will still roll 2 set of dice, and we will choose the targeted. What you will note here is one of these has targeted a gray area. We will mark it, but it will disappear since there is no ERV right here. In the next generation, it will not be passed down, whereas the one you see on the first row, 3rd column, is marked and passed down. So the mutation is passed down to the generations if it hits an ERV that is already existing when it hits. It's like you cannot damage a cup that your grandchildren are buying. You can't damage that now, if that makes sense. And then we again continue this down through all the generations. And if we take and do exactly the same comparison as we did before, what we now see is that we actually do have some groupings that are usable within the mutations. And we also have a greater gene comparison within the full genes. So we can both compare them with their ERVs, even though they are mutated and are a bit worse than before, but we can do that. We could do that with young Earth creation too, but it was a bit worse off. And we can do it with just looking at the mutations and nothing else. which I think is a point for evolution. Of course, we could argue, as said before, that these mutations are made for the purpose of the differences within the environment. So maybe the chimpanzee has a greater risk of, I don't know, lactose intolerance than the lemur or something like that. So it has a slight twist to an ERV. I can recognize that, but I think now we are starting to be at the point where now it is ad hoc. To say these things, we observe mutations happen, we observe ERVs being integrated into the system. And these things that we call ERVs, that we haven't observed, follows exactly the same pattern. But this is the point where I know that I would disagree with Donnie, because he is arguing for this, and he is arguing for it being created. But there's one more point that I think makes it basically unarguable. And that is if we look at the distribution of these mutations, not just that it's the same across lineages, but if we take the genes that we had before and we look on the young Earth creationism, and we try to calculate with the genes that are shared among many kinds and the genes that are shared among fewer and fewer, sorry, not genes, ERVs, that are shared among fewer and fewer kinds, what we see is that there is no real correlation to say how many mutations each receive on average, basically. It seems like it's just random. And if we run this simulation again and again and again and again and again, we will see that on average, each ERV will receive the same amount of mutations on average. There is no distribution that can clarify why does this ERV that only exists in humans receive one amount of mutations, while this ERV that exists across multiple generations receive hundreds of mutations. Why does this happen over the same period of time?
Well, okay. I want to make sure I'm understanding you here. So, you're saying that under the YEC, you can't, like, there's some that are receiving a lot of mutations, some that are not receiving mutations. And that's, for you, is a problem.
Well, in this, we will see some receiving a lot, but if we continue this simulation, run it again and again and again, we will see them all receiving the same amount of mutations. Of course, we could invoke hotspot and cold spot, but we would still see a distribution that is not correlated with how many creatures have this ERV. So, for instance, there are some ERVs that only humans have, H ERVs, and there are some that only chickens have. But there's also some that we share with chickens. And we can't say that just because we share them, we will find that they have more or less mutations. We can't say that under young Earth creationism. Under young Earth creationism, the amount of shared mutations would have to be the same, with the exception of purifying selection and such. That could, of course, change a bit, but we would still not see a distribution that makes sense. Let's say we discover unfunctional ERVs. Let's just say that it was originally created to be functional, right? But later something happened, a mutation happened that destroyed this ERV. For instance, I think that's the argument for the vitamin C production in humans. I think the argument is that Adam and Eve could generate vitamin C, but later a mutation happened that destroyed an otherwise perfect gene. And the same goes for lactose intolerance. That was a gene that was actually working, but later got destroyed after the fall. You must correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that's what I've understood.
That's one proposal.
Yeah. Okay. That's the one I think I've heard. But
okay.
If those are destroyed, they are no longer under purifying selection. So we should see a distribution that's the same for those, as for those that has later integrated into the system, those that are accepted as integrated and not originally designed.
Okay, I don't understand what you're saying, but I want you to go on because
Okay.
I think I'll understand it when I see the full picture. So when I see
Okay.
what you're trying to say, like when you're comparing it to evolution side.
I hope. The numbers I've written down here, you can see the 7/8. That's just that we have 8 ERVs in the first line, and within them we found 7 mutations. And the next one is that we have one with 4 ERVs, 4 shared ERVs, and that one has 10 mutations. And we have another one with 4 shared ERVs that has 6 mutations, and so on and so on, all the way down to the last one, which is 8 different ERVs, each having a different amount of mutations. And what I'm saying, and this is why I'm using a die simulation so anyone can do it, if you do decide to do this over and over again, you will find that the numbers are evening out. That when you calculate this, you will find the same average amount of mutations for each ERV instances. And in this case, it makes a graph like this. If you continued, it would be a flat graph. But I only ran it once in this case. So there's no correlation between how the ERVs are shared and the number of mutations they have. You can share it just with your brother, you can share it with all of humanity, or you can share it with, okay, not with just your brother, that would be weird in this case, but you could share it with all vertebrates or all animals, and they would have the same, on average, mutations. This also means that they can differ from others, of course, and they can be correlated to others at random. And there is no correlation with time. That is, you cannot see when was this ERV integrated, because they were not integrated, they were designed. But if you do the same thing under evolution, what you will notice is that the more creatures that are sharing the same ERV, the more mutations will that ERV on average have received. So that means if there's an ERV that only exists in humans, it will have fewer mutations on average than an ERV that exists in humans and chimpanzees, or in humans and chickens, or in humans and fish, for instance. So basically, the more creatures that has the ERV, the more mutations it will have. What this gives us is a temporal correlation, which means that we can see the nearer the ERV is supposed to be under the evolutionary model, the fewer mutations it will have, with the exception, of course, if it is an adapted ERV, which I know Donnie is arguing that most of them are, where I think they are not. But of course, I don't have the numbers or the data. That's just how I understand the argument from the evolution side. They differ from some, but not all of them, as they did with the young Earth system. And if we look at this, we see 2 very, very different graphs. And those graphs are actually the end point in this. When I look at these 2 graphs, I see things that we could test. We could, but it would be expensive and take time, but we could go out and test. So what is these distributions? I don't know specifically with ERVs if it has been done. Maybe it have, maybe it hasn't. But I think it's absolutely a predictable model, and I am pretty convinced with what I do know that this would fall out to the benefit of the evolutionary side. This, combined with the fact that we do see the mechanisms necessary for all these things to happen, simply is tipping the scales just too much within the favor of evolution in my world, combined with other sets of data, such as geological column, tree ring dating, and so on and so forth, radiometric dating. I just don't see that there's any reason to expect the other thing. But that's me. Yeah, as I say, I predict that's what we will see. So yeah, that was the slideshow.
Okay, wow, good job. Okay, well, I'm not sure I understand the last 10 minutes of what you were talking about. Okay, so I don't know if I'm quite grasping. So, like what can you try to like summarize like really simply, put it in very simple terms, like what you're the conclusion that you're making?
Yeah, sure. If we take all the ERVs that we are mapping ERVs right now, and
Yeah.
as we get them mapped, and we find, let's just say 100 that are non-functional, and we find that some of these are shared across different species and are absolutely non-functional, then if young Earth creationism is true, then we should see that these 100 has, of course, relative to their size, received roughly the same amount of mutations. That would be the young Earth model because they would have been separate lineages and they would always have been there if they are shared in the same location but are non-functional. On the evolution, we should see that those that are shared among fewer animals should also have fewer mutations than those shared across many animals. And that's a temporal correlation, simply because they would have had less time to receive these
Okay.
mutations than the others.
But right now, have we made that observation?
I don't know if we have done that with ERVs. I honestly don't know. I would actually guess we have to some degree. The main problem is that I think it is contested among young Earth creationism and evolution whether or not we can say for sure if these ERVs are functional or not. And the main reason that I'm putting this in at the end as a prediction is because that's one of the arguments from many that that's the gold standard, right? We need to have these predictions to see what will happen in the future. And what I'm saying is right now I'm actually making a prediction for both models. And I'm fairly sure with what I do know that there's no reason to doubt that evolution will come out on top of this. But if it doesn't, I will say that's a very, very good point in the camp of young Earth creationism. I don't know of any reason that it should be different, at least with non-functional ERVs. We can debate any functional ERVs, but non-functional, I have no idea why it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, the main argument for this is that we do see all the mechanisms for this being true. But I don't know if we have observed the other thing in reality.
Okay.
So
Did you have something? Are you sharing your screen?
no, I'm not.
It's showing me. Okay. Um,
Um,
okay. Well, so are these what are the points that you wanted to get from like Dr. Dan? Is there anything else you wanted to say about Dr. Dan and Donnie with regard to this, what you just presented?
Not about them. No, I won't. I actually think that both of them gave a good presentation. I think I also wrote that to you. I actually did enjoy both of their presentations. I might have my differences with how Donnie performs in other aspects, but I think this presentation, yeah, I think it was a good one. I think there was a bit reflex, but yeah, I use that myself in conversation, so I can't complain. The thing is, well, I would like to know if they think that I actually represented them fairly, both Donnie, Dr. Dan, and Mike for the matter, though I know I didn't speak so much about him. If I have misunderstood anything of the young Earth creations arguments, I would love to know, because I actually want to give it as fair as a chance I can. I have Stairway to Life on my shelf over here. We've talked together that there's some videos that I'm going to see online, but it's taking me a lot of time because every single argument that I do see, I want to examine examine as much as I can, as deeply as I can. And my current level of understanding within biology is not anywhere close to the level it needs to be to understand the arguments of both sides in technical detail.
Wow, Michlas, I'm so impressed. And if Dr. Dan or Donnie watches this, please do respond. And I in particular would like to know if there are observations confirming this type of thing that was done with the dice, like as this, and the description, the prediction that Michlas is making. Do we have any observations that back that up? So hopefully they will take a look at this and get back to us. What did you have any other thoughts?
No, not at all. I've just gone onto YouTube, so if anyone has asked me a question, I'm sorry if I haven't answered.
Oh, do you want me to scroll through? Let's see
yeah,
if there's any questions. Okay. JS says, do you have a science background?
Well, sadly, I am currently working on my bachelor's in an absolutely unrelated field, artificial intelligence and data. But sadly, due to COVID, I had to postpone it for now. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
That's okay. Okay.
So I'm just looking for questions. Okay, this is not a real question. Let's see here. And if anybody is still watching and has a question for Michlas, please do put it up there. Okay, I don't see any questions in here. The people were commenting to me some various things. But let's see if anybody puts anything in now. Okay, I'm Googling to try to find out whether we've constructed phylogenies from mutations on ERVs. Okay, that's from Peter from Paleo Logos.
Oh, hey, Peter.
And he has a great channel, guys. Please subscribe to his channel.
I agree.
Yep. And so, well, thank you so much for being here, Michlas. I hope we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, I did see a comment from Daisel Grace. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. I'm horrible with names. Yeah, I would like to talk to you about it at some point, Stairway to Life, but I've not gotten to that yet. It's still on the shelf. I need to know a lot more before I tackle that one.
Cool.
And anything else? Andrew Cumming is saying if he is representing it correctly. Yeah, I think you were representing what I said correctly. Yeah, that's what I could find.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate your participation, and we'll just keep having these conversations. So thanks, and
yes, thank you for having me. Great day.